It was just more of that. We're smarter than you. We know better than you. And we're going to give you what we know that you need, even though that it has nothing to do with any of what you want. Honestly, I think that's the curse of the entire Krakoan era.
Now, Doc and I have been talking about X-Men since the Jonathan Hickman era began with House of X Powers of 10. Excited more than I've been in a very long time. This was as excited as Doc had been about X-Men in probably over a decade at that point. It all did not work out well in the end, Doc.
We could say that it didn't work out very well in the end, but it also didn't work out very well in the middle or shortly after the beginning.
What's interesting is I think both sides of the argument, people that really wanted to stay in Krakoa and people like you and I that realized Krakoa was fool's gold and we needed to exit it, came away with the same exact conclusion that this was a wasted opportunity, that the setup from House of X Powers of 10 was really dramatic, it was effective, new status quo change that never really fully achieved what it was aimed to do. I do think there was a pretty fair article out recently, maybe didn't identify all the issues with the Krakoan era, but did identify enough of them that I thought was a good post-mortem, put a bow on this stupid era and move on with our lives. From Den of Geek, it starts out like this. The Krakoa era made the X characters' constant deaths and resurrections into a feature, not a bug. Thanks to the power of the Five, dead mutants could be easily resurrected. Essentially, the mutants became immortal. Mutants offered the rest of the world miracle medicines and promises of peace, provided that the world recognized Krakoa's sovereignty and allowed gateways to be planted on their ground.
While it was a big change, it was a fundamental change. And that's the problem. Because it was foundational, it really spoke to the ethics and the morality of the Krakoan era X-Men. It made it very, very clear that these really weren't the same characters. We gave them the opportunity to try to explain why blackmail, the supremacy, the segregation, the drug dealing was necessary and try to explain the pragmatism behind it. But instead they just said, nope, this is the good thing that we're doing. It became clear that while there was change going on, it wasn't just on the circumstances and the world that the X-Men were living in. It was fundamental and foundational to the moral compasses of the characters that we grew up loving, and kind of started from the very beginning pushing a lot of us away.
And they talk about it being a feature, not a bug, and I think in the end it definitely did end up being a bug, especially resurrection. Death was meaningless. There were no stakes in death whatsoever, so they had to explore other ways to do that, but they had no one really talented enough outside of Hickman to do that. Then also the idea that they created their own sovereign nation, then blackmailed other countries into acknowledging that, making them allow gateways, onto other sovereign countries and stuff like this. Those were reasons to think these can't be the X-Men, and they never fully explained how it still could work.
If you're arguing that the constant death and resurrection and, the afterlife roller coaster of the X-Men and the mutant characters by themselves needed to be addressed, I don't disagree. And if you want to basically make that a feature and not a bug, okay, it could be a cool idea. The problem is you still ended up having writers that didn't know that, hey, if you take death as a stakes off the table, you can no longer put their mortal peril as a cliffhanger or as a way to generate concern and angst and everything as a story, as a plot point. It can't be used that way. You have to rethink the writing process and the story and the plotting process if you're going to take something that is as big of a emotional manipulator to the reader as death and life off the table. You then can't use those as a way to emotionally manipulate people. And when it falls flat, it's not our fault. You're the one that took it away.
Next up, Den of Geek starts talking about how things started to go off the rails. For as much as Krakoa changed everything for the mutants, the franchise still ran up against some of the same problems as always. Too many books, messy continuity, and unnecessary crossover events mucked things up from the start. In addition to the flagship X-Men series, Marvel published a constant stream of spin-off books. Denny Howard's Excalibur featured Captain Britain, Betsy Braddock, and other mutants dealing with magical threats. X-Corp by Howard dealt with Krakoa's financial dealings. Legion of X from Cy Spurrier spun out of the interesting miniseries Way of X, in which Nightcrawler and Legion tried to form a mutant religion, but quickly became a dull cop book. Wolverine Overload hit its peak with the absolutely awful twin miniseries X Lives of Wolverine and X Deaths of Wolverine from Ben Percy. And that was really something that you and I noticed from the very beginning. When they announced Dawn of X and the amount of titles that they were coming out with, and that there were going to be at least 3 more following up that within 6 months, we said this is far too many books to actually make work within continuity. You're going too big, too fast. People got mad at us. In fact, a lot of people ended up stopped watching the channel because they thought we were being too negative. And we ended up being 100% correct. They went way too big, way too fast, and there were way too many big-ass crossovers.
You have 2 really ways of trying to market and expand a line, right? The first way is the way that it did it at the beginning, where there was one X-Men book. Every few years, there'd be a new spin-off book after the main title got popular enough. That's one way to do it, but that's a long, playing the long game kind of marketing and sales strategy, right? The alternative is you throw everything at the fucking wall, and then when 90% of it slides off, and that's the method that they did, but they're expecting that everything that they threw against the wall should stick. And if we, as the readers, said, well, you're just playing the throw everything at the wall and see what sticks game, we were called negative for it. No, it was very clear you don't have the talent. Even if this is like, say you have like a murderer's row kind of talent, and you could pick prime Marvel writers from every era and stick them on this. The likelihood of hitting 800, much less 1,000, which is what they were trying to bat on this, with 9 or 10 books coming out, is almost impossible. People still miss. They are not completely infallible. And we don't have Primetime Bendis, Prime Miller, Prime Larry Hama, Prime Chris Claremont. We don't have Prime everyone on this. You got like 2 or 3 moderately talented people and a bunch of fucking jabronis, and they're still demanding 1,000, hitting 1,000. Fuck you. Ain't gonna happen.
Way too big, way too fast, because they did not have the talent to support such expansion. There just weren't enough good writers. If they had done X-Men by Hickman, Wolverine, and maybe X-Force by Ben Percy, and maybe one other book, it probably would have ended up fine. And you can end up doing a crossover when you only have 4 titles. That's pretty easy. Doing a crossover when you have 9 titles ain't so easy. And it's even harder once you start trying to cross over in the rest of the Marvel Comics universe. Even in the Krakoa era, the X-Men could not escape overblown and needless crossovers. X of Swords boasted a giant battle between the mutants of Krakoa and Narako, with the fate of the mystical otherworld on the line. Even worse was Axe Judgment Day, an event that tied the X-Men to the Eternals and the Avengers, at least in theory. In practice, Axe was an Eternal storyline in which the boring Kirby creations launch an attack on the mutants because of their resurrection protocols. Judgment Day dragged out for 36 issues, most of which did little advance for the X-Men themselves.
Every single thing was overblown, and none of it could really support the size of the crossover. Even the idea behind Axe Judgment Day, very clearly a 4-issue Eternal story that should have been kept to the Eternals book, if they even do it, because it's really not even that much of a compelling Eternals story. But instead, they try to milk this thing that's barely even worth existing into 30-some issues. And X of Swords was so obviously an attempt to do 3 issues of everybody's title the way that it used to be, the 3-month crossover event, except for the fact that you tried to do 3 issues per when there's like 12 fucking titles. It should have been a throwaway story arc in the Excalibur book, because that's where it would have made sense to exist. The idea of doing it across the entire line, honestly, it was a very niche idea to begin with, and not that many people were going to be interested, because no one has ever been that interested in Excalibur.
For some reason, they decided, because Tini Howard is Jonathan Hickman's friend, we should take up the thing that Jonathan set up and the thing that Tini set up and put them into one event. Did not work out. There are a couple of high moments. There's a really cool Wolverine story where he goes to hell to get the Morons. That was cool. There's a good moment with Gorgon, where he takes out a bunch of Iraqi mutants, and that's pretty cool stuff. But you've also got Gorgon banging a rock. You've also got somebody, I think it was Brian Braddock, that's in a kitten murdering contest. So it's hard to take the stuff seriously. There's a moment here or there, but the totality of it is actually just shit, because it's fucking Vidi Ayala, it's Tini Howard, it's Jerry Duggan, and all their stupid ideas being forced into somebody's ultimate vision that was actually probably going to be pretty good.
Every opportunity they had during that crossover was an opportunity for them to, I guess, engage in nonsense. You mentioned the kitten murdering, the rock fucking. You had the one that was a fight to the death between Wolverine and the Summoner. And when Wolverine killed the Summoner won because he's the one that died. This might as well have been called like X of
it's
puns.
like Tee-hee-hee, the fucking comic book.
Yes, and that was the problem. Outside of like 2 or 3 maybe interesting kind of offshoot issues, the rest of it was tee-hee-hee, look how clever I am. I'm just going to play semantics games with you the entire fucking series. I mean, you had like 3 issues dedicated to a fucking dinner party in the middle of it. And this is before the Hellfire Gala existed. They thought that was enough to justify doing an entire dinner party event.
Remember they introduced like the greatest Wolverine nemesis in the history of X-Men?
Yeah, the guy that we don't even remember his fucking name.
What's his name? He's got adamantium skin.
Solomon.
I think you're right.
I think so. Yeah, the remember it was Wolverine's new arch nemesis. Arch nemesis implies pinnacle of opposition. You can't decide who that character is. The audience does. It was just more of that. We're smarter than you. We know better than you. And we're going to give you what we know that you need, even though that it has nothing to do with any of what you want. Honestly, I think that's the curse of the entire Krakoan era. A bunch of fucking retards giving us what they know we need rather than any of the things we tell them we want.
Den of Geeks also noticed that they botched the ending on this one. Ultimately, the failure of Axe captures the primary problem with the Krakoan era. It never fully embraced or explored its big ideas. By the time Axe released, immortality is just one more reason for humans to hate mutants. Fall of X storyline, which ends the Krakoa era with the fall of House of X and Rise of the Powers of 10, try to complicate the simple good mutant, bad human binary by having Xavier join the machine-human organization Orcus, the central evil faction of the entire Krakoa era. But that turned out to be nothing more than a plot juke so that Xavier could speak with Moira, thus sewing the whole thing up pretty neatly. Fall of X at the end, and those 2 miniseries, and even X-Men 35, Uncanny X-Men 700, was just the most limp dick ending.
Do you remember during the marketing for House of X and Powers of X, before any of the issues came out, the first teaser image from promotional art was Xavier and Moira staring at each other on a bench, and
the most
Xavier
important moment in X-Men history. Yes,
exactly. The entirety of Fall of the House of My Balls and Rise of My Johnson, the entirety of that series and everything attached to it was designed specifically to bring us a redo of that scene so it could go differently.
With much worse art, by the way.
With significantly worse art and 10 times worse dialogue, because Jerry Duggan thought that would be poetic. And that's what it was. They just needed an excuse to bring it back to that, to do some sort of poetic justice type plot thing. It didn't matter how you got there. It didn't matter what you did with it. It just mattered that you were there. When it was done poorly and everybody just kind of groaned because it was so obviously poorly executed, they thought they were being oh so clever. Instead, they were just oh so fucking cliche.
I guess the big goal in the end was to make Magneto the good guy. Now he's the one that's fighting for mutants in the right side of history, and then Professor X is the bad guy forever. And they made sure to have him murder some extra person there at the end, just so you know he's evil. You
have a lot of people that seem to be in that office that more, I guess, associate or identify with Magneto, and it was very, very clear for a very long time, because most of the Krakoan era was just nothing but Xavier, or Magneto's dream with Xavier in charge. And now what? They're going to do the also poetic justice of Xavier's dream with Magneto in charge? We fucking did that. And it was done a hell of a lot fucking better than any of you clowns could have ever attempted to. And definitely better than all the fools that are in that office right now. including the ones that replaced the fools that were in there before.
They then end the article like this: "It's not the end of the Krakoa era, nor even the reset to a more familiar status quo that disappoints. It's the part in the middle, when X-Men comics had compelling new concepts in space and time to explore them. More often than not, those ideas were drowned out by a morass of spin-offs, crossovers, and formulaic story beats, leaving so much of the potential of the era unrealized. The Krakoa era offered a brief chance for the franchise to grow in compelling ways, but it fell short, refusing to fully embrace the conceit of mutants and change itself." And while I definitely have differing opinions on what broke Krakoa era, I do think they wrapped that up quite nicely. They had the opportunity to do something special. They drove off Jonathan Hickman because they wanted to stay in this era because they thought this was the right place to be.
I don't disagree with the way that they end, and they ended it exactly right, because it's not the end of Krakoa. They're not even distancing themselves from it. In the book that came out this week, that is a post-Krakoa era title, Heir to Apocalypse, that's kind of the bridge title over to the From the Ashes era, it's very clear that they are not leaving Krakoa or the ideas, and they're not abandoning the idea behind it. Now, I disagree. I guarantee I disagree with them on how they missed all of the opportunities, because all of the missed opportunities that they ended up having were the ones I predicted before House of X and Powers of X were even over. I couldn't have predicted the Hickman getting voted off his own island thing, but regardless, all of the plot problems were very clear to anyone reading at the time. It was a fundamentally flawed idea, but it could have been done well. And they missed every opportunity to tie up those very clear loose ends. And not only did they not do it, they frayed them more and more and more with every passing week, until it became a tattered cloth that there was no choice but to depart from.
And that will wrap up our coverage of the Krakoan era, at least for the time being. Maybe we'll revisit it here in a couple of years, but we are moving on to From the Ashes. And Doc and I will be looking at From the Ashes with a new perspective, hoping that it gets better. But, at this point, you kind of expect the worst. But if it's good, we will let you know that it's good, and we will certainly be covering it not only here on YouTube, but certainly on Think Critical Patreon, where you can get the full discussion about the end of Krakoa, as well as the full review of X-Men Heir to Apocalypse #1 this week. If you want to check that out, there's a link in the video description.